Welcome, everybody. I'm Joel Fewer. I am the Executive Director of the Lowell Milken Institute, and we welcome you today to our program, Los Angeles Law Firms Before and After Recessions. This program is built in part around a new report authored by UCLA law professor Jim Park, and that report will be published by the Lowell Milken Institute. The report is entitled Los Angeles Law Firms Before and After Recessions, and we gave you a link to a preliminary version of the report so you could take a look at it. It follows on a report that Professor Park did in 2018 entitled Law Firms in Los Angeles After the Financial Crisis, and that report is on our website, the Lowell Milken Institute website. Obviously, the health and future of Los Angeles law firms is of importance to all national law schools, including and maybe especially UCLA Law School, and to lawyers in California. The State Bar of California reports there are almost 200,000 active lawyers in California, of which more than 1/4 are in Los Angeles. So we're very, very excited to be able to present to you today a distinguished panel of both academics and practitioners to talk about Professor Park's paper and to talk about law firms in Los Angeles and beyond in general. Let me introduce our panel. First, I have Professor Ellie Wald, who's the Charles W. Delaney Jr. Professor of Law at the University of Denver Strum College of Law. Professor Wald is a nationally recognized expert in legal ethics and a legal professions scholar. He's written on such topics as increased lawyer mobility, the nationalization and globalization of law practice, conflicts of interest, attorney disqualification, and fiduciary duties to clients. Professor Wald is a co-author of one of the leading casebooks on the law governing lawyers, and prior to joining academia, he practiced at Paul Weiss in New York. Richard Kolodny is the founder and president of the Portfolio Group, one of the country's top legal recruiting and placement firms. Mr. Kolodny's legal search and placement practice is focused on representing partners, practice groups, and other highly qualified lawyers seeking outstanding lateral opportunities. As one of California's top partner recruiters, AmLaw 100 and AmLaw 200 firms frequently engage Mr. Kolodny to conduct confidential partner and practice group searches. He also represents law firms in merger and acquisition transactions, as well as branch office acquisitions. He practiced law for several years at O'Melveny & Myers before starting the Portfolio Group. And finally, UCLA Law Professor James Park. He's also the co-faculty director of the Lowell Milken Institute for Business Law and Policy and has been so for about 3 years. He's an expert on securities regulation and corporate law. His new book on public companies and securities fraud is scheduled to be published next year by Cambridge University Press. And prior to teaching law school, Professor Park clerked for federal judges, worked at a large New York law firm, and then served as Assistant Attorney General in the Investor Protection Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's office. Okay, so what we do, as we've always done in these programs, is we will go for approximately a little over an hour with questions that I've put together and have shared with the panelists. And then for the last 15 minutes or so, we will open it up and you can either put questions in the chat or raise your hand and we call on you. I want to start the conversation by discussing some definitions that I think are very, very important to the paper. And first, I want to talk about what we mean by a large Los Angeles law firm. So Jim, your report focuses on large law firms in Los Angeles, and you actually use a sample of large law firms to develop some of your conclusions, but you don't identify the law firms by name, which I think is intentional. And I think I actually suggested it as well, that perhaps you not do that. But could you at least tell us the characteristics of the type of law firm in your sample?
Absolutely. And thank you, Joel, for putting together this panel, for your comments on the report and for supporting this project, both this report and the prior one in many ways. I also wanted to thank my research assistant, Alan Jiang, who did a good amount of research over the summer and over this past year. Thank you to Daisy De Leon for formatting the report. I also wanted to thank Jody Kruger and Gabe Juarez from the library, who have tracked down a lot of the data for me. And thanks also to Richard and Ellie for participating in this panel. I'm really looking forward to learning from you. For both reports, I've looked primarily at law firms that are listed on the National Law Journal's list of the 350 largest law firms, and that's a list that's been around for a long time, since the late 1970s, which allows for comparison over time. The ranking is based on the number of lawyers that are part of the firm nationwide. And so it does not necessarily reflect the law firm offices in Los Angeles that we've been interested in. To get the size of the Los Angeles firm offices, fortunately, the National Law Journal actually breaks down the number of lawyers employed in a particular city's offices. And so I was able to get that information and compare it over time. For the first report, we looked at about 60 law firms, 60 National Law Journal law firms with offices in Los Angeles. What we found is that the more established firms, the firms that had been in Los Angeles for longer, were getting smaller in size, but that decline was more than offset by new entrants to the market. National Law Journal firms coming and opening up Los Angeles law firms. For this report, we used a smaller sample of law firms because we're comparing law firm offices over time since 1985. And so there are only a limited number of firms that have had an LA presence for that number of years. And so the sample is much smaller. It's only 13 law firm offices. 7 of them are firms that were founded in Los Angeles, and 6 of them were founded outside of Los Angeles. As of 2020, the total number of lawyers employed in that sample is about 1,750 lawyers were employed by these 13 firms in Los Angeles law firm offices.
Okay. So Rick, let me ask you, does it make sense to even talk about large Los Angeles law firms? A lot of the large Los Angeles law firms that started in Los Angeles now actually have more lawyers in other parts of the country than they have in Los Angeles or even California. I think that's true of both the firm I was with and the firm you were with.
Yes,
so does
very much.
Is the idea of a large Los Angeles law firm a thing of the past?
You know, and first of all, thank you, Joel, for inviting me to participate in this panel. We have enough material to have about 10 of these. Jim's reports are dense and full of a tremendous amount of information. And on unpacking it, we could spend a lot of time unpacking it, but we're going to skim the surface of a lot of things. And I just as a preface to my comments, I'm going to contradict myself a lot. We're talking about law firms. We're talking about law firms where one size not only doesn't fit all, but people, culture, leadership, philosophies, client base, billing rate matrices. There's a tremendous amount of variety embedded in that NLJ 350 that Jim referred to, and indeed within the AmLaw 100 and AmLaw 200 list. So we're generalizing, you know, from 50,000 feet, which is always dangerous. And so I'm going to say a lot of things that probably are completely inconsistent and self-contradictory, but getting that out of the way. And Jim, I started practicing at O'Melveny in '81, so that's one of the longitudinal survivors of that period of time. But to answer Joel's question, you know, LA firms, to me, we're talking about an interesting issue because national firms, and this bleeds into a little bit of a topic we're going to address, I think, later in the program about the Cravath model that Jim and Ailey both have things to talk about. National firms are not just Los Angeles firms. As Joel said, Gibson, Dunn, and Latham now have, and O'Melveny, but particularly in the case of, and I'm going to name some names. I don't have the academic constraint. All of my clients are important. All the firms I'm going to talk about are you know, substantial and have achieved things that few others have. But I'm going to name names because I think it's helpful. Latham, for example, I think has basically 850 lawyers on the East Coast between New York and Washington, D.C. They have an office in New York of over 500, about 350 in Washington. Gibson Dunn has a very substantial presence in both cities, as does O'Melveny. The East Coast lawyers outweigh the West Coast, LA-based lawyers, by a wide margin. And in fact, for many firms like Paul Hastings, Seth Zachary has been chairman of Paul Hastings, based in New York, for a very long time. Gibson just handed off leadership from Ken Doran, who was a longtime LA partner, to a partner in New York. But the center of gravity of many of these firms has shifted away from Los Angeles. Not only that, but when you're talking about the AmLaw 100 and 200, to me, and I'm going to just drop a bunch of observations that we can pick up if you think it's warranted, I see a broad spectrum of firms, some of which are certainly colored by the Los Angeles law firm landscape. When I think of Los Angeles firms, I think more of Mitchell Silberberg today and Jeffrey Mangels and Buckhalter than I do of Gibson Dunn, Latham, and O'Melveny, which I view really as national firms. And I think if you talk to partners randomly at Gibson and Latham and O'Melveny in New York or DC, they view themselves as working at national firms, not so much LA firms. And they are a part of very large enterprises. So when we get back to defining the group of 13 or 7 or the earlier group of 60 LA firms, the question is, what does that really mean? Is Skadden LA an LA firm? Well, I don't think so. What's interesting, and I just jotted a few things down. Today, when you look at the leverage stats in the American Lawyer that were most recently published based on last year, leverage being the total number of lawyers, excluding equity partners, divided by the total number of people. Total number of lawyers excluding equity partners divided by the number of equity partners. What's surprising today, and this goes to whether we're talking about the national adoption, the top performers in the AmLaw 100, if you look at the top 25, 35, 50 firms in the AmLaw 100 and the leverage stats of those firms, you find some very interesting things. Manat's leverage is higher than Skadden's. Loeb and Loeb's leverage is higher than Cravath's. And Shepard Mullen's leverage, these are all based on the most recent published stats in the American Lawyer. Shepard Mullen's is higher than Sullivan and Cromwell. So we can know, to me, looking at these firms, and that's partly a result of the large number of non-equity partners that many of these firms have, as well as counsel, senior counsel, special counsel, the tiers that have been created over the last 30 years that are relatively new and that didn't exist in as wide spread of form at the time of your first report. So when we talk about LA firms, I think we also have to be cognizant of the fact that we're talking about firms that are national, many of whom have more lawyers outside of LA, and many of whom have adopted this high performance, top tier kind of leverage as a model throughout the firm. So the LA firm concept is an interesting one that I think has a number of caveats and qualifications for us to really talk about. Is it meaningful as a construct? That's just sort of something I'd like to put out there.
So Elliot, one of the reasons I wanted you to be on this panel is that you've written a lot about national firms and the national practice of law, but you're also based in Denver. So you have a completely different perspective. And in preparing for this, one of the things I did was I looked at what was going on in Denver in terms of the largest Denver firms. And what I found was interesting of the top 5 in the list in the Biz Journal for Denver, only 2 have more lawyers outside of Denver than in Denver. So is Denver not doing what has happened in Los Angeles, or is it actually following the same trend?
So in a nutshell, it's following the same trend, but I have to piggyback on what Rick said. There are many qualifiers and caveats, and let's start with a few that will be intuitive to many. Denver is a classic example of a mid-market. Yeah. So to begin with, when we talk about large law firms in Denver or in Colorado, we're not talking about the same animal or creatures that we do when we refer to LA firms. So just to give you all a sense, in Minneapolis, Indianapolis, Salt Lake City, Denver, if you have 100 lawyers in the main office, that makes you a large law firm. So I think that Jim was exactly right to start by looking at national lists, like the list of 350 or the list of the top 100 or 200 that Rick referred to. And we have to remember that when we look at the largest of the large, at least in terms of the number of lawyers, we really, as Rick pointed out, are looking at national firms, or so often global firms. That makes it, as Rick pointed out, interesting to talk about what we even mean by historically LA firm or San Francisco firms or Denver firms. But with all of those caveats in mind, to answer your question, Joel, I think that to understand trends in big law firms, we have to move away from just looking at the size of law firms, but to look at two things. First, look at the model that the firm uses. And second, as Rick pointed out, pay close attention to who we count and how we count. So very briefly, here's what I mean. Cravath, Swaine, and Moore, that Joel referred to before, is in some ways today a boutique law firm. It's not a global law firm. It has one office. Now, it happens to be in New York City, so some people still think of it as a New York City law firm. But it has one main office and a small satellite office in London, with the basic attitude, I mean, no disrespect to Cravath, if you want Cravath to represent you, you come to us, we don't go to you, we don't open offices. So that's one model. As Rick and Jim pointed out, there are other law firms that adopted a global model. When you adopt a global model, you oftentimes have a reason to be in the main financial markets. So you start perhaps in LA, and as Rick pointed out, you end up with a large office in New York City, and sometimes in DC, and sometimes in Hamburg and London, not to mention Beijing and Tokyo and a few other key sites. But that's in part, as Rick pointed out, not just a function of how many lawyers you have, but the model you adopt. Are you a global law firm? Are you a quote unquote boutique law firm? Are you perhaps, many of the law firms on the AM 200 are more of what they would think of as regional law firms. So they have a grab hold, say, on the mountain region, like Colorado-based firms, or the Indianapolis, Minneapolis corridor. They try to stay out of the East Coast and West Coast to avoid certain kind of competition. So make a long story short, it's not just that we have to talk about LA trends or Denver firms. We really need to worry about the model of organization. So that's point number one. The second one, I'll simply echo what Rick said. In today's age, simply counting lawyers, even putting aside profits per partner or profits per equity partner, which is the kind of ranking that a lot of lawyers, law students, juniors, and seniors are interested in, but even putting that aside, who qualifies for the count, as Rick pointed out, is essential. In the quote unquote good old days, or rather more simplified days, we roughly counted partners and associates. Today, whether you count, as Rick said, whether you count just equity partners and income partners, whether you count associates, or whether you also count staff attorneys,
Yes.
maybe even temporary lawyers, let alone this new category of counsel, by which you don't mean the semi-retired, you mean someone who's not going to make partner and is still permanently at the firm. That will change significantly the headcount. And it complicates Jim's life tremendously, because to compare law firms in 2020 with law firms in 1985, where the headcount is done very differently, is a very complicated task. So let me just stop there, Joel. So
well, let me follow
I
up.
don't live up to the stereotype of an academic whom you ask a question and he takes 45 minutes to
But
answer.
I'm gonna stick with you for a moment, Ellie, and then we'll go to Rick on this, on the second big definition item, and that is recession. So I received an email yesterday from a lawyer at Hogan Lovells talking about the white hot M&A market that's going on. So we're in a sort of different idea of recession perhaps than we have been. I wonder if you could comment on that, and then maybe Rick could as well, who sees it from, I think, some different angles.
Right. So I'll say, just maybe just to start a conversation and not dominate, I'll simply say that I think that it's Jim is absolutely right. It's very interesting to compare recessions, but one ought to perhaps note that this particular recession that we're in the midst of, or mini recession, if you will, is quite different than past recessions. So I think intuitively, a lot of observers, legal and otherwise, might say, well, of course, the recent recessions were driven by economic factors, a housing bubble, a few other things. This one is a public health recession. And as we hope, I hope not to jinx anyone, but we hope a year later to be emerging from the public health recession, we might expect a much quicker recovery on the legal side, if only because some of the underlying driving forces of the recession were different. So I'll just say, so first, it's important and valuable to compare recessions, but not all recessions are created equal and the causes are different. Also, I'll simply suggest that it may very well be that large law firms are quite very smart, sophisticated institutions, and they've learned from recent recessions. So we've seen, and I'll just begin the conversation, we've seen that by and far large law firms fared better. They were more stable this time around. They didn't terminate partners, income, let alone equity. They rarely terminated associates. In fact, if one has to do something, as Rick said, quite dangerous, try to summarize complex trends in a few sentences, it appears that most large law firms were able to survive by instituting temporary pay cuts for both associates and partners, which by and large they reversed by now. So let me just stop there. Joel, I think that, like I said, that recessions, both the causes are different and the reactions to them by large law firms and their large entity clients have been quite different.
So Jim, I want to get to you in just a moment about that very point about what large law firms may have learned from the 2008 financial crisis. But before I get to that, Rick, I want to go to you on this issue of recessions, because it strikes me that given your business, you see a wide range of legal practice groups.
Yes.
And you might be able to give us some insight on whether we're witnessing a recession or what we are witnessing.
Thank you. And I just want to pick up something Ailey just said, which is that firms were much better, much smarter, I think, coming out of the 2008 to 10 deep recession. Every law firm managing partner remembers the day in 2009 when Latham sent an email firing 200 associates. That was a shot that was heard loudly throughout the land in terms of big law. Firms didn't really staff, although there were peaks and valleys in the post, and I'm no economist, I look at this all more as an anthropologist, but although there were peaks and valleys and various things going on in terms of economic cycles post 2011, 12, when we were emerging from that, by and large, as Ailey said, firms were staffed right-sized. They weren't staffed for a tremendous amount of work. And that's why right now, in fact, and I'll answer your question, Joel, but just to fast forward to right now, almost every big firm, the top firms in the country, to generalize the top AmLaw 50, are all desperately short of capital markets associates, M&A associates. There was a period when it was bankruptcy associates, but associates in certain practice areas, SPACs, capital markets, M&A, dire shortage nationally, precisely because they had staffed right-sized and not had bulked up. But this was, just to answer your question briefly, this was, if it was even a recession, it was something dramatic that we've never really seen before in terms of a shock to the system. Ailey is right about how law firms responded, but you had the unusual situation of, after the initial shock, the hot practice areas for top firms were simultaneously restructuring, M&A, capital markets, SPACs, employment, and real estate, all firing on all cylinders, more or less at the same time, if we telescope basically, May 2020 till the present, say, for the last year. And seldom would restructuring, for example, in prior cycles be booming. at a time when M&A and capital markets were booming. Now they're, secular trends, low interest rates, money being pumped into the system. The world didn't end. So there are a lot of things going on. But the interesting thing is that a lot of law firms, when you look at the recent AmLaw numbers that were released for 2020, Milbank was up 17%. This firm was up 15%. This firm was up, 18%. The numbers were actually surprising and strong. And that reflected towards the second half of the year, hiring kicked in of associates. Now, lateral partner hiring really never retreated very much although that initial shock, was a shock to the system and the pause button was hit. But lateral partner hiring, if anything, accelerated as firms realized that they were not, viewing the end of the world scenario. I'll stop there.
So Jim, you in your report talk about the offices of large law firms in Los Angeles declining and have been declining for some period of time. And I think you connect that decline to the idea that that may be of real assistance to them in any kind of downturn of the economy. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Just to throw out a few numbers from the report, in 1990, the sample of Los Angeles firms had 2,400 lawyers, and this was at the peak before the 1990 recession. Today, as I said earlier, in 2020, those same law firms employ 1,750 lawyers overall. And so that's a telling number if you think about it. The last 30 years or so, these law firm offices have been reducing their presence in Los Angeles. Now, it has gone up and down over time. In 2007, the firms were back up to about 2,300 lawyers. And so there has been some fluctuation during this time period, but the overall trend has been one of decline to some extent. And if you'd asked me 3 years ago when we wrote the first report, I would have said that the impact is mainly because of the 2008 2009 recession, that was sort of the shock that required some readjustment in LA firms. I think we're far enough out, though, from that recession to say that it was that recession that has caused this shift out with respect to the more established big LA firm offices that we've seen. What's been causing the shift? I think you can break it into long-term factors and perhaps some shorter-term factors. I think over the long run, we've just seen more corporate headquarters leaving Los Angeles for various reasons. We saw the S&L industry, for example, collapse in the late 1980s, which had an impact on LA firms. I think bank mergers and other developments have reduced the number of financial institutions in Los Angeles. Also, more generally, technology has gotten better. Law firms are more efficient. There's less need for large staffs, and so that's another ongoing development. More work is shifting towards to corporations in-house, and so that is also a factor I think that has been affecting Los Angeles. And then finally, more recently, over the short term, I feel like there's been an increased emphasis on profitability with respect to the partners, and to the extent that you are in a market that may be sort of lower on average in terms of profits per partner, because these are big national law firms. These are firms that can shift resources internally. And I think that's one of the big developments that we've seen over the last 15 to 20 years, that if you are a national firm, then you have pressures and incentives to allocate your staff to those areas where you're going to be generating higher profits. And I think that certainly seems to be more in New York City, maybe more in Northern California now with the boom in IPOs. One last thing I wanted to say about the current recession is the interesting thing about the current recession, and I'll put on my securities law hat now, is that the markets relatively early on began incorporating the possibility of recovery into stock prices. And I think that's sort of what has perhaps saved law firms, at least in the short run, because of all of the economic activity that has been generated, starting maybe in the late summer or so. I'm a little worried, though, about the activity. I think one interpretation of the flurry of activity is let's sell stock while the market is still high. Is that going to continue? And we had a great program on GameStop a couple of months ago. We see a lot of unusual activity in the marketplace. And so it remains to be seen what the capital markets will do over the next few years, although there is some reason for optimism given the significant amount of stimulus and low interest rates. But I am not completely sure we're out of the recession at this point in time, but this has been an unusual recession relative to other recessions where the economic impact on law firms has been much more significant.
Okay, so I have a series of questions that are about both the business model for the practice of law and also the use of the profits per partner metric. So let's start first on the business model. We've sort of mentioned this idea, Rick raised it, about the Cravath model, or the model that's traditionally used for large law firm growth of bringing in associates and creating this pyramid with a high ratio of associates to partners, a high leverage ratio. And Jim, you argued in your report that this New York model or Cravath model really never took root in Los Angeles. And Ellie, you've written a lot about this model in detail and have provided some critiques of the model, including some ideas about other successful models for law firms. So I'd actually like to start with you, Ellie, and maybe you could explain a little bit about your arguments about these sort of different business models that are out there for law firms.
Absolutely. So first of all, Jim will be sympathetic. This is the peril of empirical work. Joel, you referred to the so-called tournament of lawyers, the argument that Galanter and Pallari introduced. And colloquially, oftentimes people refer to that notion, the notion that there's a tournament to become a partner, and law firms, there's a pyramid, Joel, you said, and law firms increase the base by hiring more and more associates, and then they make more partners, so on and so forth. So in defense of Professor Galanter and the Tournament of Lawyers, remember the book was based on empirical work that was studying not LA firms and not Denver firms, but essentially not quite New York firms, DC firms, Chicago firms, but it was an empirical study of a subset. And later on, in kind of loose conversation, everybody started talking about the theory of the large law firm, as if that study that was limited in scope, geographical scope, and otherwise, really portrayed the national and global picture. And it didn't purport to do that. So now to come to the point. Jim is, of course, right. This so-called Cravath model that was descriptive of the elite law firms in New York City, really, as a matter of fact, and this was before any recession, was not accurately descriptive of what I refer to as the other law firms. The law firms in LA, the law firms in Denver, the law firms in Minneapolis, Indianapolis, and Salt Lake City. So just to give a sense, what does the other model look like? So historically, and this is still true to some extent with a subset of LA firms, and certainly true in mid-markets like Denver, large law firms simply never hired a large class of incoming associates. They never used the ratio of, say, one equity partner to 6 associates, or one partner earlier in the early days to 2 or 3 associates. They hired more on a 1-to-1 ratio. And if some of the students in the audience and associates are saying, oh gosh, this may explain Jim's numbers, part of why you see LA law firms that are smaller is because they restructured and they're simply hiring fewer associates. It's not that they have fewer equity partners, they have fewer associates. If some in the audience are saying, oh boy, this is a complicated phenomenon, it's not necessarily bad for junior lawyers, and here's why. If you are, as Rick mentioned, if you are operating under the classic Cravath model, when I think Joel said, I had the pleasure of practicing at a large New York law firm. The day I started, there was 106 associates of us hired on the same day. And they told us on day one, congratulations, in 8 to 10 years, 3 of you will make partner. So the expectation was that the vast majority of associates did not make partner, roughly 3%. If you're starting in LA these days and you're hearing that firms are hiring fewer associates, that may be disconcerting, but they're hiring fewer associates, retaining a higher percentage of them and making a higher percentage of them partners, which is actually good news in some way. So just to answer Joel's question, there's one model, which is the model most people are familiar with, is the Cravath model. It's we hire, every year we hire a crop of first-year associates, and 8 to 10 years later, we promote some of them to partner, and that suggests over time an exponential growth of the firm. That's one model. Another model is the one-to-one ratio. We hire much fewer associates. We promote many of them. The rate of growth is much smaller. But like I said, that whether or not it's good or bad, it depends on one's perspective, so on and so forth. And just to, so there's that model. And then there's yet another, Joel, model of subject matter specialization. So I'll just say a few words about that. It used to be under the Cravath model. Paul D. Cravath actually described his law firm as a corporate law firm. Surely there was a litigation ancillary department, but Mr. Cravath himself thought of litigation as the failure of prudent corporate planning, right? So it was a corporate law firm. And these law firms, the corporate law firms, especially if they were in a financial market, say New York City, focused on certain practice areas to the neglect of others. Models that we're seeing in California, not just LA, and mid-markets are law firms that are much more diversified in terms of subject matter expertise. So I don't need to, here's a common thread to Colorado and California, water law. So all of a sudden we see large law firms that have huge departments, that are not just IP and not just, of course, M&A and so on and so forth, but natural resources, renewable energy, water law, all swath of areas that weren't the typical large law firms forte. And that suggests, again, some stability, such as Jim told us, and Rick mentioned too, when you have, say, a recession like the recession we are coming out of, if it was a recession, a mini recession for law firms right now, when litigation was very, very slow, if you had subject matter diversity, and as Rick said, other departments generated a lot of income, the firm was more stable. So I'll stop there, but to sum up, there's the global firms with the engine growth, there's the one-on-one ratio, and then there's the subject matter diversity. And Joel, there are many more. The large law firm is anything but a monolith, and to assume that there's just one model is simply not to understand the market in which Rick is placing lawyers.
Joel can't hear you.
Yeah, perfect segue, because now I wanted to go to Rick and his placement of lawyers and what that placement tells you about the business models that law firms are using.
Thank you. And just let me pick up some threads from what Jim said, what Ailey said. With respect to what Jim said, it's funny, I'm not an academician and I have no empirical data, but having practiced in LA for 40 years, I can tell you that the landscape now is opportunity rich and dense because of the influx of out-of-town firms. And I'm just talking for a minute about Southern California, not the Bay Area, which itself is a whole different dynamic and interesting with Wilkie Farr, Paul Weiss, Freshfields, Debevoise opening in the Bay Area. But in Southern California, you have today, for example, when I started practicing, Kirkland and Ellis wasn't on the West Coast. Today, they have an LA office of almost 200, and they have another 200 in the Bay Area. So you've got Kirkland and Ellis that was new to the state, essentially, now with 400 lawyers. You have Sidley Austin, which didn't have a Century City office and now has a very active, significantly sized Century City office. You've got Vincent and Elkins that just came into town this past year. Allen and Overy. You have over the last 10 or 20 years seen an enormous number of firms come into LA. And there was a comment, Jim, that you made that was interesting in your first report about the fact, I may have this wrong, I apologize if I do, that the diminution in size, and I forget what year the first report was written, the diminution in size of the major LA firms like Gibson, O'Melveny, Latham, created opportunities for out-of-town firms. I think it's different than that as I see it. The large top performers that I alluded to earlier in the AmLaw 100 are driven by their focus, relentless focus on premium work. In fact, I'm going to read you something that was, I'm not going to attribute which firm said this, but the managing partner of a major LA firm said this: the key to the future for us is deepening and broadening in 4 areas: M&A, finance, private equity, IP, and white collar. Geographically speaking, we're focused on 5 key markets, not just New York and London, which are the classic 2, but those that continue to define the high end: the Bay Area, because of tech companies, Washington, D.C., and Asia. Now, LA is not mentioned in that, which is interesting. But the flip side of that is that for a wide swath of firms, Dwayne Morris, Cozen O'Connor, Thompson Coburn, Hush Blackwell, Blank Rome, the middle market that Ailey referred to before is their bread and butter, and they wanted to plant a flag here, and many of them have grown quite successfully here precisely because the large firms and their relentless focus, this is why they're able to maintain the equity profits per partner that have not only competed, but in some cases exceeded those of their native New York firms that have even larger offices, but they're not interested in the lower rate sensitive middle market work that, after all, is that is the vast tapestry of Southern California. We're in a gigantically diverse economy with no one single characteristic. And even though some say the entertainment, streaming, media, legacy studio business is a feature, economically, it's not a feature in terms of revenue contribution to any national firm. It's a boutique-driven kind of thing or smaller firm practice. And although Latham and other firms have successfully executed on a larger scale in that, Paul Hastings too, it's a unique industry town thing that doesn't color most of the national firms' practices. Instead, because of the rate differential, which is a very critical underpinning of the success and economic growth of the national firms, and colors their leverage ratio, and colors where they're opening offices and why, and which clients they're following. The billing rate opportunity created by those firms not being interested in lower rate work has opened the doors wide in Los Angeles and other markets. I did a quick head count. There's something like 35 out-of-town firms in Denver today. Some small, but there are a lot of out-of-town firms. Many of the out-of-town firms in LA are not small. So that leads me, Joel, to your question, and I don't want to make this a long soliloquy. The opportunity is that these other firms need to be staffed. Kirkland and Ellis doesn't have 400 lawyers in California because they sent 400 lawyers from Chicago to California. So the keynote, as far as I'm concerned, and this will sound like a hairstylist telling everyone they need a haircut, but the defining trend of the last 20 years or 30 years has been the lateralization of partner ranks. Some firms doing it very aggressively and on a mass scale, and you've had in prior years firms like DLA Piper and K&L Gates hiring 40, 50, 60, 70 lateral partners a year. King and Spalding had a bumper crop last year. Some of those are in groups, some are individually, but the lateralization of the profession, featured in every year in the American Lawyer, having a talent lateral partner report issue in which 2,000 plus partners change jobs in the AmLaw 100 and 200, has created opportunities for partners to move from the legacy firms to out-of-town firms. And the one other thing I want to say that we haven't touched on in that much depth is, to me, when people are thinking about firms as laterals, as partners, we're not talking about associates now, which is a fascinating topic of its own. It's not so much that a partner says to him or herself, gee, that's a Boston-based firm and I really want to be with a Boston-based firm. More likely it is they have tremendous strategic practice depth in life sciences, in real estate finance, in emerging growth. So it's the firms that have developed Chambers Tier 1 rated reputations, practice depth in strategic practice areas that is very appealing for people who want to connect with firms with depth and breadth and reputational advantage, competitive advantage in those areas. So it's not that much that people say, gee, I've got to be with with a Texas firm, with a Dallas firm. Yes, that can happen. And there are people with client synergies that drive that. But more often, I think it's driven by strategic practice focus. And it's created, as far as I'm concerned, tremendous numbers of opportunities for people that are looking at the now wide range of choices that they have that they didn't have 10 or 20 years ago.
So, Jim, let me turn to you then, because this is, again, a good segue to this idea about the metric of profits per partner. And I know Ellie has written, I think, an interesting piece on that metric and whether it dominates too much our thinking. And you used it to some degree in your report. And I'm interested in your thoughts about it. Certainly as a former partner of a large law firm, profits per partner were very important. And I think law firms, one of the things they worry about is losing very important partners who are generating lots of revenues because they can go somewhere else with their clients and receive a higher percentage of the profits or more of an absolute number. So what's your view about whether or not as a profession we're too caught up with this metric?
Thanks, Joel. I'll be brief. I'd love to hear what Ellie and Rick have to say on this issue. I will note that in the corporate law world, it's a very hot topic as to whether corporations should be run solely for the shareholders or also consider stakeholder interests. And law firms are different. They're not public, and so there are different obligations that they have, but they are large financially significant institutions. And I would be surprised if that, some of the debate about stakeholderism that has been so active in the corporate world does not transfer over into some of the law firm world. And I think it does seem like partners per profit is a metric that seems to be more emphasized. At least a number of the articles that I have read have mentioned this. And the other striking thing that I recall is after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, a lot of firms reported higher profits per partner over time. And I'm not sure why that's the case. I mean, one theory might be, are they trying to project strength? Is it more important to be high up in those rankings? And if that's the case, is that resulting in some inefficient decision-making, decisions that emphasize short-term results over more long-term prosperity? And from my perspective as a law professor, my biggest concern is our students and their ability to start out and get their careers started. Is that sort of a cost that is being externalized because of a growing need to sort of create the perception of prosperity?
So Ellie, you've written about this some and have made an argument that maybe law firms, or at least certain law firms, either have not paid as much attention to profits per partner and paid attention to other metrics and other ways of thinking about their business. So I'd be interested in your views on this, about whether we're spending too much energy on this single metric.
So first of all, just to correct, I'm going to try to be cute about it. Every self-respecting large law firm that is interested in stability and survival pays close attention to profits per partner. So I don't mean to suggest at all that there is a single law firm that does not pay attention to PPP, or these days profits per equity partner. It's of course important to everybody. The question is not so much whether some law firms don't pay attention to other factors. The question is whether they pay attention to some other factors in addition to paying attention to profits per partner. But I want to say two quick things, and this would be again interesting, I think, both for those. It will build on what Rick said in terms of those who are looking to move, and even students, as Jim said. First of all, remember, Rick and I refer to this phenomenon of restructuring that has gone over the last 20 years or so. And just to situate, to bring everybody quite to the center, to create a floor. So we've seen, Jim mentioned this phenomenon of the rise of in-house legal departments, and one wouldn't want to suggest that that's the key factor, but roughly since the early 80s, there's the rebound or the return of the Jedi, right? The resurrection of in-house counsel. And large law firms over time begin to respond to the rise in power and work done by in-house legal departments. And part of the restructuring is to reduce the number of associates they use, in part because corporate clients don't tolerate the old model of first-year associate Ellie will do a first draft, give it to fourth-year associate Jim, who will give it to seventh-year associate Rick, who will then turn it to Joel, the junior partner will report, and the client is paying for all of that. So what's happening, though, as large law firms generally rely on fewer associates, and they tier up the partnership tier and have equity and income or the different designations partners, and as Rick said about an hour ago, rely also in terms of leverage on lawyers they don't count at all in terms of their PPP, like staff attorneys. When you look at profits per partners, you want to make sure you know what you're looking at, and different firms report different things. And so here's what I'll say. As Rick pointed out, for those of us, say, graduating from UCLA, and you think about what job offer to take, what Rick and I are saying, I think, together is, you want to, of course, it's important to get a job offer, but once you have a few of these, you might want to start asking, do I want to go to a global law firm? Whereas Rick pointed out, it will give you a kind of a shortcut as to what work you're likely to do, what the emphasis on the firm would be in terms of the strong emphasis of partner profits per equity partner, your ability over time to create a book of business and to grow it, so on and so forth. Or as Rick said, you might want to go to one of those firms that he referred to, that he thinks of these days as the quintessential LA firms. And again, Joel, to answer your question, it's not that these firms don't think about profits per partner. Of course they do. But as Rick pointed out, they don't compete in the same super tier, and they are able to also pay attention more explicitly, not to the exclusion of profits per partner, but more explicitly to question of work-life balance, to question of investing in the human capital of the lawyers. Again, it's not that the elite law firms don't do it, but some of the more subject matter diverse, and some of the firms that Rick referred to as, they say, LA, what he thinks of as the LA law firms today, if you want me to be blunt, they're never going to win in a battle against the global firms if the only metric they're trying to compete to hire and retain lawyers is the profits per partner. They don't offer the same compensation, they never will. So they offer a lot of compensation, but they try to make themselves and turn themselves into the kind of workplace that also sells other factors, like work-life balance, maybe a sabbatical program, maybe a on-off ramp, so on and so forth. So in other words, to sum up, we live in a day and age in the 21st century, everybody pays close attention to profits per equity partners. And I think it's the world we live in, it's the world we're likely to live in until all of us retire. But there's certainly immense diversity, as Rick pointed out, in terms of firms that, in addition to paying close attention to PPP, also promote and pay attention to other metrics, from diversity of the lawyers and to all sorts of other things that they think would help them be competitive and retain, not just recruit, but retain their human capital talent over time.
Okay, in the few minutes that we have left before we go to audience questions, I want to change themes for a moment. So I think all of us probably every night say a little prayer that in the fall we will be back on campus or back in our offices. Rick and I typically have lunch together 2 or 3 times a year. I'm looking forward to doing that, sitting out in a restaurant and enjoying a meal with Rick. How do you think the pandemic and this past year and what we've learned in this past year is going to change how people practice law in law firms? So Rick, I'll start with you.
Well, there was a little blurb that was on, I think, the American Lawyer the other day about how Womble Bond, a mid-Atlantic firm, basically halved its office space in a new lease that they just signed for their, I think, their main office. I think that trend is certainly, as lease renewals come up in a cascade over the next however many years, we're going to see a different look for many firms. And remember, pre-pandemic, that had already accelerated with, remember, law firm libraries? That was sort of a thing of the past. So many firms over the last 7 years have evolved into looking like more high-tech Facebook, Google-esque Amazon workplaces. What the pandemic's impact on those sorts of configurations, where a lot of the associates didn't have dedicated offices and had communal workstations. I think the good news is, one of the trends I'm seeing is there's actually more than a few green shoots that are coming out of the ground that indicate that partners may be able to work remotely, more or less completely, and not just limited to, well, if you live in Brentwood, you could work for a downtown law firm. I'm talking about, LA people working for Texas firms and Denver firms. And I think that's going to become more the norm, setting aside state bar issues and all of that type of thing. I think it's going to loosen a profession up that has been very geographically focused on so much. Associates, I can just tell you that associates have a very peripatetic mindset now. And a lot of people worked not in their city of employment when the pandemic hit, but went to somewhere, whether it was a hometown or with parents or relatives, or just got out of Dodge. And I think that's going to lead to some further movement down the road. How fast, I don't know. But I think the pandemic will have lasting consequences, as well as obviously, we've all become adept at Zooming. And whereas, 7 people from Gibson Dunn might have flown to Texas to meet a client, that type of thing, I think, is going to become more and more infrequent. Most people, I think, would think that's a good thing, but that's here to stay too. I think Zooming, and in fact, lateral partners are switching firms based entirely on Zoom interviews with no in-person meetings. That has been happening now for a good 9 months. Associates too, of course, but in the case of partners, it's even more unusual to, for initially when partners heard about that conceptually, they were in disbelief. People are now coming around to the fact that that's just reality.
Jim, you have a view on this as to other things that will?
Not much. I don't know if Ellie has anything he wants to say.
Ellie would like to add 2 things. First of all, I think Rick is exactly right. And so I want to reiterate what he said, is that everyone who's looking for a quick transformation of the legal profession is ill-familiar with the history of the legal profession. So Rick gave a very compelling example, which of course leases will cascade over time. It's not as if, even if it's true that a large law firm would love to have its say the number of floors that it occupies downtown, it may not be able to do so. And a lot of law firms have discovered that force majeure clauses are not as easy to negotiate as one would think, not to mention that Rick told us a half an hour ago, a point again I want to stress. There's also the concept of, even if you could get out of your lease, do you want to? There's space implicates status, how many floors you occupy of where, and how luxurious and how much marble there is in your lobby is important to elite law firms because they trade in branding and in status. So Rick's first point is, yes, we're going to see a lot more virtual workspaces. I completely agree with, but it will take time and it will vary from region to region and firm to firm. So that's point number one. Point number two, which is a very important caveat, is Joel started us off an hour ago, reminding us there's more than 1 million lawyers in the country, and more than 200,000 in California. We have to remember that the four of us are talking about large law firms. For many, many clients and many lawyers, the bread and butter of the practice will continue to be, when we can, in-person meetings. So Rick, again, is absolutely right that a lot of clients will not have any large law firm fly 7 of its lawyers anywhere. There's no need for it. But when your divorce is falling apart, when someone is trying to evict you, when the state is trying to throw you in jail, meaning not the practices of large law firms, a lot of clients would want to see a lawyer in person, shake a hand, and lawyers will continue to deliver in that model. So at the same time as we're seeing immense pressure on the deregulation of law practice and the use of AI and all this fantastic growth, not just of LegalZoom, but all of its competitors, at the same time that that is happening, we'll continue to see, I think, for a long time, the traditional in-person model of law practice outside of big firms. So what does that mean? With these two caveats, I'm completely with Rick. I think that what we'll continue to see is the proliferation of virtual workspaces, especially for large law firms, exactly in the ways that Rick handled. So I just want to finish with the example he gave. The model of, say, the University of Denver feeding the majority of associates in the Denver, Colorado firms, and UCLA being a huge driver in the, not just in LA, of course, but in Southern California. I think Rick is right. Not tomorrow, not perhaps in 5 years, but the trend to watch is a complete nationalization in the sense of UCLA feeding large law firms all over the country. And the bad news, other large elite law firms and other law schools feeding and competing on UCLA's home turf. I think that's the trend to watch. But as Rick pointed out, for large law firms, not global, not for the entire profession, and not tomorrow. It's going to grow gradually over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Okay, well, I'm going to open it up to audience questions, but I just have to say I'm going to be a contrarian. I'm skeptical about the Zoom universe and law firms for the following reason. I'll be very brief. I think, having been a partner in a law firm and spent a lot of time in recruiting and in associate development, I think that it's very, very difficult to build a culture that a successful law firm needs on Zoom. It is much easier to do that in the physical world, to have someone, a partner, walk into your office to just talk with you about things, or have an associate walk in and just talk, to have those conversations, which I think are actually critical in creating a culture. And I think culture, and Ellie, you have actually written about this with a law firm that you studied in Denver, is absolutely critical to successful long-term law firms. So I've had this conversation with lots of different people, including my wife, who's on your side of the things, about thinking that it'll be less people in the office, but I actually think law firms will go back to it. But we'll see.
Joel, can I just say, and I'll do something that one shouldn't, which is speak for Rick, but he will of course correct me. I don't think that Rick and I was saying, so it's important to correct. Even in 10 or 15 years, we were not projecting a future in which large law firms will have completely virtual offices. Right. Or that, and we completely agree that there are synergies in culture, and the mentoring and training is hard to do online, at least with the AI tools that we have now. Right. But I think with if you said, Joel, fine, then give me an example of what you are saying in 10 or 15 years. I think we're more likely to see hybrid models where associates come into the office 3 days a week and not 5 days a week, where they share offices as opposed to have dedicated offices. The practice groups come together in different ways. That's what I think, Rick, tell me if I'm doing injustice.
No, exactly.
That's what we suggested, not the virtual large law firm, because as you point out, Joel, we are many years from that reality if we ever get there.
Exactly.
All right, then we're all on the same page after all. Why don't I open it up, and if people from the audience have questions, if you just raise your hand, there's a hand raising function in Zoom, or otherwise let yourself be known, and I'd be happy to call on you. Well, I'm not seeing any, so let me ask then one more question that I have. If you think of a question, just let me know. So one of the things that I think that's sort of interesting, and Jim, you've sort of talked about this a little bit, is recessions sort of change the way clients behave. And one of the things that we saw was in the 1990 recession was there was a lot of movement in-house, so that you had in-house lawyers handling lots of things that outside law firms had in the past handled. An example that I always point to is the Wonderful Company, which was started by one UCLA law alum, Stuart Resnick, who they have a team of nearly 30 lawyers in-house. And I've interviewed the GC of the Wonderful Company, and they handle everything, soup to nuts, literally, inside, occasionally going outside if they need someone for like a Supreme Court argument. Are we going to see more of that, do you think, Jim?
I think, one of the points of the report is recessions, they spark change, and they disrupt the system as it's gone on previously. And I could see, maybe some more of that over time. But, the other factor that is sort of probably a concern for lawyers is many more non-lawyers are providing legal services, and that potentially could increase as clients become more cost conscious. And there are a lot of businesses that are suffering in some way, and they could continue to face certain pressures over time. So I think that we see in 1990, 2000, 2008, that with every recession, you see more firms moving away from lockstep compensation. You see more firms using non-equity partners. And I suspect that we'll see similar pressures after, in the coming years.
We have a question from the audience. Mr. Mandel, you had a question?
Well, there are probably few on this Zoom session who are as old as I am, but I thought, as I was listening to the wonderful speakers, history just kept injecting itself into my mind, and I thought maybe it would be a little bit instructive. I started practicing in LA in 1965 at the boutique law firm of Tuttle and Taylor. Some of you are old enough to remember Tuttle and Taylor, but for those of you who are not, it was the boutique firm, if I say so myself, in Los Angeles. I was the 9th lawyer to join. I guess 3 or 4 were already United States Supreme Court law clerks. And that was kind of the history for the firm as we progressed into the 80s. And I was a corporate and securities lawyer, and evolved into being the senior partner in that particular practice group. Then the carpetbaggers arrived, starting with the New York firms, and then, as you know, Washington, Chicago, San Francisco, and other metropolises. And Tuttle and Taylor prided itself on its work lifestyle balance. That was a big attraction, whether it was a Supreme Court law clerk or a graduate of a fine law school. And it was a success. The firm was happy. Everybody was feeling warm and fuzzy, even though we knew we weren't maximizing our income potential. And then when the out-of-state firms came, or out-of-city firms in some instances, the attraction, they were attracted to a place like Tuttle and Taylor because of the high quality lawyers. And they had the perfect selling point to those who had mortgages and kids going to private schools and heading toward college. Oh, I know you love Tuttle and Taylor. It's a wonderful place. But what would you think about going across the street and doubling your income? And the result of that was that some resisted it, but some were attracted to it. And the ones who were attracted to it were the ones who were more bottom line oriented. And to make a long story short, some left to go to the law firms. Some, like myself, went into first into corporate America and ultimately into a higher education, legal practice. And the firm slowly withered, and this spectacular place wound up in the late 1990s and dissolved. And I can't tell you how many times lawyers from my generation have said, what happened to Tuttle and Taylor? It's such a fabulous place. Well, this is the story, and I find it resonating with the speakers because they are describing the same phenomenon. And I'm talking about the 80s and 90s, and apparently a lot of that phenomenon still exists today. And I just felt a need to share that because I really am resonating with what the speakers have to say.
Can I respond to Joe?
Yeah.
Joe is my role model, so I say this lovingly to Joe, who I see almost every day in my neighborhood. So Joe, you raise an interesting point, and I would give you a counterbalance, although you could view it the way you just described it, no doubt exactly as you feel. Ray Fisher, who was one of your partners at Tuttle, and just a great person, and went on to be on the Court of Appeals, was attracted by the opportunity of moving to Heller Ehrman with Warren Christopher's blessing. And I don't go back as long as you do, but I know some of the history, not because he was bottom line oriented solely, he wouldn't have become a judge if he was, but because he saw an opportunity to expand his practice in terms of a national platform with visibility that, although Tuttle was in its day one of the mainstays of the LA legal community, it ultimately became less of a mainstay as it was eclipsed by other firms, whether good or bad. It was just factual. Similarly, other people, Bob Stern went to Morrison and Foerster, others that many of us, Joel knows well, fantastic people that weren't attracted as such simply because someone offered a larger paycheck, but because of an opportunity to open an office, to be part of building a new firm. And although today, certainly, and look, that goes back to the 80s. When I was at O'Melveny, not to tell war stories, and I'll be brief, a partner lateral to O'Melveny, I think in 1982 or 3. And the associates looked to the left and looked to the right and said, what's the matter with this guy? Because no one had lateral to O'Melveny downtown LA office.
Right.
But what you're remarking on, I think, in part, certainly has more than a grain of truth, which is today, some firms are writing very, very, very large checks. And you have Paul Weiss hiring away Cravath Partners for reported numbers of 8 to 10 million a year in terms of guarantees, multi-year guarantees reported at Kirkland and Ellis of very large numbers. And that has led to a perception that the lateral market is driven by people that only want to maximize compensation, which I have to tell you, I don't think is a fair or accurate view of what many people find as compelling opportunities driven by strategic practice strength of the firm they're going to. Depth of, for example, Kirkland's private equity practice attracts a lot of people, as does their restructuring practice. Joel's former alma mater, Gibson Dunn, has such depth in litigation and corporate and M&A. People find that beyond compelling as practitioners because they're part of an organization that is just firing on all cylinders and is very, very high octane. So I think it's a mix of things, and it's not just the competitive allure of higher compensation that draws people. And I would say that the top firms really aren't interested in partners that have sharp elbows that are driven by a desire to maximize their income. they're looking for good corporate citizens. People don't move for short-term bumps, or one hopes they don't. It's a long-term thing. And so top firms are looking for good corporate citizens that will become integrated into a firm. So I feel for Tuttle and Taylor, but it had a lot of great folks that weren't motivated by the bottom line. Had to say that. See you
And
tomorrow.
Joel, we can maybe end by generalizing Jim's excellent point and by giving one example that will drive to everybody's attention kind of where we are in 2021. So Jim will tell you that if you look at the largest law firm in LA, and let's even simplify, assume they have 200 equity partners. Now that's quite rare, but assume that you find one. And let's rank them very quickly in terms of the books of business, because that's the world we live in. It's not the only way to rank, as Joel told us, but one way to rank, and law firms certainly do that, is to rank them by the book of business. So we can rank them most profitable, number one partner, all the way to 200. What Jim is telling us, and this was true in the 80s and it's true today, if one or two people from your top 10% are leaving, that's uncomfortable and unpleasant to a law firm of this size, but it's not destabilizing. What Rick, I think, is saying is for a whole host of mix of reasons, not one and not two, but out of you're in a law firm with 200 equity partners, if 5 or 6 or 10 or 20, and this will become a self-fulfilling prophecy, people begin to leave, then it destabilizes the entire structure and can, in the extreme, cause not just mass defections, but even collapse.
Yeah.
So I think that what Jim is telling all of us is that this is the new normal. We would expect to see more mass defections. At the same time, large law firms have never been more profitable in terms of equity profits per equity partner, and Rick said can offer these deals that Paul Weiss is offering to Cravath and vice versa. At the same time as more law firms are experiencing distress and instability. That's just part of the new normal, which allows me to conclude with the point that Joel was making. If you're a law firm in LA and you don't have 200 equity partners, but you have a core of partners and you want to retain them, it's exactly where we started, right, Joel? Yeah, you want to make sure they get compensated handsomely, as Rick said, but you really want to try to emphasize the other reasons as to why they would want to stay. And as Jim will tell us, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, both for Tuttle and other law firms. So it is the new normal in 2021.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Ellie and Rick. Thank you very much for joining our panel. And Jim, thank you very much for putting together the report, which, as Rick said, has hours and hours and hours of information that will allow us to discuss. And maybe we'll do another panel a little bit later. And to all of those who attended, thank you very much for taking the time and attending and participating in our panel today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joel, for putting it together, and Jim.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.